The sound of the gun shot shattered the stillness of the night. A tragedy unfolded that would echo through the community and beyond. On June 21st, 2022, at the Emerald Pines apartment complex in Gulfport, Mississippi, 27-year-old Shawmayné McClam, a black transgender woman, was shot and killed during a late-night encounter. Her sister was critically injured, and several family members, including children, were present in the apartment at the time. The suspect, 20-year-old McCary Gasway, fled the scene on a bicycle, leaving behind a trail that would lead investigators to uncover a story of prejudice, violence, and a community grappling with its own biases. But what led to this fatal confrontation? Was it a crime of passion? Was it an act of violence? Or was there a deeper, more troubling motive? As we delve into the details of this case, we will explore the life of Shawmayné McClam, the events of that fateful night, and the aftermath that has left a community searching for answers. Stay with us as we uncover the truth behind the tragedy at Emerald Pines. Welcome to the Inside the Crime Mind. If you're watching right now, drop a comment with the location you're watching from and give this video a thumbs up. More jaw-dropping true stories are on the way. Shawmayné McClam wasn't just a victim. She was a woman full of promise, full of life. She grew up in Gulfport, Mississippi, a town where tradition ran deep, but where change was slowly making its mark. She knew what it felt like to be different. As a black transgender woman, she faced challenges that many could never understand: hate, prejudice, and rejection. Yet, she wore her identity with grace, never allowing the weight of the world to define her. She was known for her vibrant energy and her determination to live authentically despite the odds stacked against her. Shawmayné wasn't just a transgender woman. She was someone who overcame adversity with resilience. She had dreams, big ones, dreams that reached beyond the narrow confines of her town, beyond the pain of exclusion, to a future where she could make a difference. That's why she decided to pursue her certification as a nursing assistant, to heal, to care, to be the kind of person who brought light into the lives of others. Shawmayné had just earned her CNA license and was preparing to take the next big step in her life, becoming a traveling nurse. She was excited about the opportunity to work in different places, helping people who needed her compassion and skill. It was the kind of job that allowed her to move beyond the limitations of her community and become a symbol of strength for others like her. But Shawmayné's journey wasn't just defined by her ambitions. She was also defined by the people she loved and who loved her in return. Her family, especially her mother, her sister, and her brother, was the cornerstone of her world. Her sister, Kenesha, shared an especially close bond with Shawmayné. They were more than sisters. They were confidants, the kind of bond that felt unbreakable. They'd been through so much together, supporting each other through thick and thin. Shawmayné's mother always saw the best in her. She recognized Shawmayné's warmth, her kindness, and the unshakable desire to help those around her. She was proud of the woman Shawmayné had become, despite the world's attempts to tear her down. Her mother's heart swelled with pride as she saw Shawmayné living her truth with such authenticity. She had big plans, a future full of possibility, a life that she was only beginning to embrace fully. But even with all the beauty in her life, Shawmayné had vulnerabilities. She knew all too well the harsh reality of the world, especially for someone like her, a black transgender woman in a society that often viewed her as less than. She had faced verbal abuse, rejection, and the scorn of those who couldn't understand her. There were nights she would cry herself to sleep, wondering if the world would ever fully accept her for who she was. But still, she carried on. She was a fighter. She always had been. Despite the hardships, Shawmayné's heart remained open. She found joy in the small moments, the moments with her family, her friends, and the people she held close. She had an infectious joy that made anyone around her feel welcome. She was a friend to many, a sister, a daughter, someone who believed in making the world better for everyone. And yet, as we all know too well, life doesn't always work out as we hope. But on that night in June, the course of Shawmayné's life was abruptly cut short. The moment she had been preparing for, the life she had dreamed of, came to an end in the most violent and senseless way. It wasn't just the loss of a woman full of dreams. It was the loss of a symbol of hope for many others like her, whose struggles were often invisible to the world. Her family, her friends, the community, none of them were ready for what would happen next. And neither were we. But what led to this? What happened that night between Shawmayné and McCary Gasway? What was the catalyst for the horrific violence that took her life? Stay with us as we dig deeper into the heart of the story. The tragic events of June 21st, 2022, where a meeting that started with conversation would turn into a deadly encounter, and a life filled with potential would be lost forever. It was a night like any other in Gulfport, Mississippi. The air was warm, with a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the trees that lined the streets. The sounds of the world at rest, the soft chirping of crickets, the occasional car passing by, filled the night. Everything seemed calm, serene. But beneath this quiet facade, something far darker was about to unfold. At the Emerald Pines apartment complex, an ordinary evening was taking place inside apartment 6B. Shawmayné McClam, excited about her plans for the evening, was preparing for what she thought would be a peaceful night. She had invited McCary Gasway over, a man she had met online, someone she had been chatting with for weeks. It was supposed to be a casual meeting, relaxed with no expectations. They had planned to watch a movie and enjoy a simple evening together. The apartment was cozy, filled with the warmth of the soft glow from the kitchen lights. The familiar hum of the refrigerator, the clink of dishes being placed on the counter, and the low buzz of a TV in the background created an atmosphere of normalcy. Everything seemed so ordinary. But that was the calm before the storm. McCary arrived shortly after, stepping into the apartment with the kind of casual energy that comes with a first meeting. He smiled, and they exchanged small talk as Shawmayné offered him a seat. The mood was light, comfortable, and for a moment, everything felt perfectly fine. But the undercurrent of tension was already there, unnoticed by both. It was then, in the quiet of that living room, that Shawmayné made a choice. She had grown accustomed to revealing her transgender identity to those who had never known. She wanted to live her life openly, to embrace her truth without fear. With a steady breath, she told McCary, "I'm transgender." What should have been a simple statement, a truth she had shared with so many before, was met with something unexpected, something frightening. McCary's expression changed almost instantly. His body language grew stiff, his smile replaced by something colder, an expression of shock, discomfort, and confusion. For a moment, there was silence, the kind of silence that hangs in the air, heavy and suffocating. And then, without warning, something shifted in McCary's demeanor. The tension that had been building beneath the surface snapped. In an instant, the air was thick with the weight of what was about to happen. Words were exchanged, angry words, fueled by prejudice and confusion. It wasn't the reaction Shawmayné had expected. It wasn't the response that she had hoped for, but it was one that many transgender individuals know too well. McCary, in a split second of emotional turmoil, pulled out a gun. The sound of it, the soft click of metal against the air, seemed to echo in the stillness of the apartment. Shawmayné, still in disbelief, was taken completely off guard. It was a moment that passed so quickly, but in that moment, everything changed. The sound of a gunshot rang through the apartment, sharp and final. It was the sound of a life being taken. Shawmayné collapsed, the life draining from her body as her sister, Kanisha, who had been in the other room, rushed to her side. The chaos was immediate. Shawmayné's family, still in shock from the events unfolding, scrambled to react, to make sense of the violence that had erupted in their home. Kanisha, terrified and frantic, was injured in the chaos as she tried to protect her sister. The room was now filled with the sounds of shuffling feet, frantic cries, and the harsh, metallic smell of blood that seemed to fill the air. The reality of the situation hit. Shawmayné was gone, and the once peaceful apartment had become a crime scene. The family, once gathered together in joy, was now caught in the horror of an unforgivable act. McCary, realizing what he had just done, fled the scene. The screech of his bicycle tires cutting through the night was the only sound that followed him as he disappeared into the darkness. It was an odd detail, one that would come back to haunt him later, a man on a bike fleeing from a crime scene. But at that moment, it was the only thing that was clear. He was gone, and the devastation he had left behind was only just beginning to unfold. The police arrived shortly after, their sirens cutting through the quiet night. They entered the apartment, immediately recognizing the severity of the situation. Shawmayné's lifeless body, her sister's injuries, the blood, everything spoke of the brutality of the crime. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of a struggle. The violence was unprovoked, and the question hung heavy in the air. What had driven McCary to do this? The investigation was only beginning, and yet the pieces of the puzzle were already starting to form. But there was one question still unanswered. Why had McCary fled the scene so quickly? And where was he now? Inside, the details of the crime were chilling. Shawmayné lay lifeless on the floor, her body sprawled in a pool of blood, a gunshot wound to her chest, the kind of violence that left no room for misunderstanding. Her sister, Kanisha, was severely injured, but still alive, a witness to the horror that had taken place. The family, in a state of shock, could barely comprehend what had just occurred. The officers began their work immediately. Evidence was collected from the scene. The bullet casings, the bloodstains, and Shawmayné's personal belongings strewn across the floor. Nothing seemed out of place except the violence. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication that Shawmayné had fought back or struggled. Everything pointed to the fact that this had been a premeditated act. As detectives spoke with the family members, they learned the details of the evening's events. Shawmayné had invited McCary Gasway over for a casual meeting, an opportunity for them to meet face-to-face after weeks of chatting online. But it had ended in something much darker than anyone could have imagined. Detectives discovered Shawmayné's phone on the kitchen counter, still open to the conversation she had been having with McCary. Text messages exchanged between them seemed innocent enough. The breakthrough came when detectives reviewed the surveillance footage from the apartment complex. In the grainy images, they saw McCary leaving the building on his bicycle shortly after the shooting. It was an odd detail, one that struck the investigators as suspicious. Why was he on a bicycle? Where was he going? The camera followed him as he disappeared down the street, disappearing into the night. But that wasn't the end. Just a short distance away, another piece of evidence was found, a trail of bloodstains leading toward a nearby apartment complex. And there, hidden behind a dumpster, was a firearm. A gun, discarded hastily but carelessly. The discovery of the gun was key. It was the same weapon used to kill Shawmayné. The investigators now had a clear link between McCary and the crime scene. The bloodstains suggested that McCary had been injured during the incident and had tried to cover his tracks by fleeing the scene. But why hadn't he called for help? Why hadn't he tried to explain his actions? As the investigators pieced together the timeline, they found something even more unsettling. McCary had vanished. His whereabouts were unknown, and it seemed like he had purposefully gone into hiding. The man who had killed Shawmayné was now on the run, evading capture. Days passed, and the investigation into McCary's whereabouts continued. Then, just as the case began to hit dead ends, a new twist emerged. McCary contacted the police himself. But this wasn't a call to turn himself in. Instead, It was a phone call that would throw the investigation into disarray. He claimed that he was innocent, that he had been coerced into making a confession. McCary's sudden change of heart raised more questions than answers. Had he been part of something more? Was there someone else involved in Shawmayné's murder? Or was McCary truly the victim of his own emotions, trying to justify an unthinkable act? And if so, why lie about his involvement now? The detectives were left with conflicting statements and very little to go on. Was this a false confession meant to mislead the police? Or was there more to the story that had yet to be uncovered? As the investigation deepened, McCary's background came under scrutiny. What had driven a 20-year-old man to commit such a horrific act? Was this a case of violent emotional reaction, or was there a history of deep-seated prejudice that had finally exploded into violence? His online history showed a pattern of anti-transgender sentiment, but could that be enough to explain what happened that night? The more they uncovered, the more chilling the story became. It wasn't just about a single violent act. It was about a person who had been driven by hate, fear, and confusion. Someone who couldn't reconcile the truth about Shawmayné's identity and allowed that to fuel a moment of fatal rage. Stay tuned as we explore the chilling confession that would reveal the truth behind the murder, and the unexpected twist that would send shockwaves through the investigation. McCary Gasway was only 20 years old, yet in the span of a single night, his life, and the life of Shawmayné, would be forever changed. A quiet young man from Gulfport, McCary had always been somewhat of an introvert. He spent much of his time online, chatting with people from all walks of life. And that's how he met Shawmayné, through a dating app where they connected over common interests like music and movies. At first, it seemed like a harmless exchange. But little did Shawmayné know, McCary's mind was a cauldron of confusion and internal conflict, especially when it came to accepting Shawmayné for who she was. McCary came from a background where ignorance and intolerance often flourished. While his family was not openly hostile, McCary had always been surrounded by an environment where prejudice, especially against the LGBTQ+ community, was not only common but accepted. He had little understanding of the transgender experience and struggled with his own perceptions of gender identity. This confusion, coupled with the deep-seated prejudices he had absorbed over time, would become the explosive catalyst for the crime that night. It was in this room, during his confession, that the raw truth began to emerge. "I felt betrayed," McCary confessed. His voice quivered as he recalled the moment. "Shawmayné told me she was transgender. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know how to handle it. I just lost it." In McCary's mind, the revelation that Shawmayné was transgender was a betrayal. He felt deceived, blinded by his own ignorance and societal biases. It wasn't just the shock of learning the truth. It was the emotional turmoil that overcame him, the deep-rooted discomfort and fear of something he couldn't understand. And in that moment of confusion and shame, McCary reached for the one thing he thought could restore his sense of control: violence. But in his confession, McCary didn't just take responsibility for his actions. He admitted that it was his inability to manage his emotions that had led to the tragic event. He knew that his reaction had been overblown, that his violence wasn't born out of self-defense or necessity, but out of deep emotional immaturity. And this was the painful truth. McCary's crime was the result of a society that had failed to educate and challenge prejudices like his. It wasn't just his actions. It was the toxic beliefs that had shaped him. The crime was as much a reflection of his emotional state as it was of the larger societal issues surrounding gender identity and acceptance. The trial of McCary Gasway began shortly after his confession. The courtroom was charged with tension. On one side, Shawmayné's family, mourning the loss of their daughter, sister, and mother. On the other side, McCary's defense team, ready to argue for a lesser sentence. The case had captured the attention of the public, as many were left wondering if the justice system could truly account for the emotional and societal complexities behind the crime. The prosecution was clear in their argument. This was a hate crime fueled by prejudice and ignorance. The defense, however, took a different approach. They painted McCary as a young man who had suffered an emotional breakdown, unable to process the revelation that Shawmayné was transgender. But despite the defense's arguments, the evidence was damning. There was no denying the brutality of McCary's actions, nor the premeditated nature of the crime. The prosecution's case, filled with emotional testimonies from Shawmayné's family, left little room for leniency. McCary's actions were inexcusable, and the jury knew it. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. McCary Gasway was found guilty of second-degree murder. The sentence would follow shortly after, a moment that would forever change the lives of both McCary and Shawmayné's family. McCary was sentenced to 50 years in prison, with 30 years to be served and 20 years suspended. The courtroom was silent as the gavel came down, sealing his fate. But for Shawmayné's family, there was no sense of closure. No matter the sentence, no amount of time would bring back the daughter, sister, and mother they had lost. Shawmayné's family, devastated by the loss of their loved one, could never truly find solace in the trial's outcome. The emotional scars would remain long after the sentence was handed down. The world had lost a beautiful soul, and the justice system had handed down a punishment, but the wound left by McCary's actions would never fully heal. The tragic death of Shawmayné is more than just a heartbreaking story of violence. It's a reflection of deeper, more systemic issues that we, as a society, must confront. This was not just a crime against one woman. It was a crime against humanity, a reminder of the ignorance and prejudice that still pervades our world today. Shawmayné's murder exposed the dangers of unchecked prejudice, the kind of hatred that manifests in violent actions, especially when it's rooted in ignorance. But it's also about something more, a society that often fails to protect its most vulnerable. Transgender individuals, particularly Black transgender women, face an alarming rate of violence, discrimination, and marginalization. This case highlights how far we still have to go in ensuring safety, equality, and justice for the transgender community. Shawmayné's story will never be forgotten. Her legacy lives on in the hearts of those who knew her and in the countless lives she touched with her kindness, strength, and resilience. Her family, her friends, and her community will continue to honor her memory. But the fight doesn't end here. We all have a responsibility to challenge prejudice, to support those who are vulnerable, and to create a society where no one has to fear for their life because of who they are. If you're moved by Shawmayné's story, we encourage you to share this video, to speak up. Let's work together to build a world where justice is not just a word, but a reality for all. Like, share, comment, and subscribe for more stories that need to be heard. Together, we can keep Shawmayné's memory alive and fight for the change she dreamed of. Thank you for watching. And remember, true justice begins with understanding, empathy, and action.